This is the Panasonic GH6. If you've watched this channel for any time, you'll know that I've had videos on this channel from the GH1 now up to the GH6. When the GH1 came out, it was a small, tiny camera body. And that small, tiny camera body had a 4/3 sensor. But it wasn't just any 4/3 sensor. It was a multi-aspect sensor. So there's been, and I blame this on Panasonic, there's been confusion for ever since 2009 on the size and crop factor when it comes to these GH cameras. For 16:9, when the GH1 and GH2 were out, it was about 1.85 or maybe 1.9. It's somewhere in between there. It's bigger than 2, and it's big enough from 2 and close enough to Super 35 that you really didn't notice a difference. And I mean Super 35 in the Canon sense, where the 7D and some of those cameras were a little over 1.6 crop. So when you went originally to the Panasonic cameras, the crop factor, your lenses look pretty similar to what you would expect on a crop sensor, a typical crop sensor. When the GH3 hit, the crop factor of these sensors went to 2x for 16:9. There was no longer a sensor that was wider and taller in different directions. It was still the same height, but it wasn't as wide anymore. So what you had was a more cropped in version of what you had before, and that went from 1.8 something, I think it's 1.85-ish, to now 2.0. And again, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it makes a difference on the way that the video is captured. And it got worse with the GH4 in 4K, where it became 2.3x in 4K mode. And then with the GH5, it went back to 2. And the GH5S returned the multi-aspect sensor, but then with that, you lost IBIS. And the GH5-2 came out, and that also had a 2x crop. So, but it had IBIS back as well. And so I was personally hoping with the GH6 we'd get that multi-aspect sensor and IBIS back. It's not as bad as the GH4. It's a 2.0 crop. This is state of the art for the size of the sensor. But just off the bat, this is an amazing camera, but it's smaller than what I personally like from a Micro Four Thirds camera, which is that 1.8 or so crop. This camera is a whole lot chunkier than what your older GH cameras were like. It is now the size of a full frame camera, fan included, which honestly doesn't make any noise. This is essentially a small S1H, including full V-Log. And this is the first Micro Four Thirds camera that has full V-Log in it. So, along with all the other attention to detail Panasonic has put into these cameras, we've kind of gone away from what made Micro Four Thirds so great in its spot to begin with. So I'm kind of talking about diffraction here, and I could be wrong on this, but I believe the GH2, its native ISO, or at least when you were using it, you didn't get any less dynamic range when you're shooting at ISO 160. And so with that, you could shoot in daylight. You could also stop your lens open, and you didn't have to worry about diffraction, which on a smaller sensor, diffraction happens earlier. With the GH6, in order to get the full dynamic range out of the sensor, you need to shoot at ISO 2000. And that's a problem. It's a problem because you need to use, well, here's some things. Normally, when Micro Four Thirds came out, it was the most adaptable mount. It was the first super adaptable mirrorless mount. So everyone put on different lenses. This is a Sigma 18-35, probably the most popular third-party lens for it. And everyone gets speed boosters. This is the Viltrox, which isn't as good as the Metabones brand, but it does the job. So everyone was speed boosting and putting these lenses on these cameras in order to get more light to the sensor. And more light to the sensor means you had the appearance of possibly a larger sensor. You're not making the sensor larger, you're just making the lens faster. And you're adapting those lenses and getting the most out of those lenses by squeezing down that focal range onto that smaller sensor. Well, now that you're boosting light in and everyone's boosting light in and you've upped the ISO, now you're going to have some huge 10-stop ND filter on here if you want to shoot in daylight at the highest dynamic range, which to me is a huge problem. Now, I don't think this camera looks bad at ISO 160 below its native ISO, which I think in Vlog is 250, 320-ish. I should double check on that before I talk about it. But, you know, talking about this, some of this stuff is so complex. You have to keep it in your head and then deal with so many cameras with so many different settings. It would be nice if the native ISO was just laid out for you there, unlike the extended dynamic range ISO that's just there at 2000. It starts at 2000 and you can't go below 2000 in log. Undoubtedly, everything that you get out of this camera is excellent. There have been so many things shot on a GH5 that look incredible. The GH6 will essentially do the same thing. But if you want a slightly better image than the GH5, you're going to need to go into high ISO. And high ISO is awesome for night, but most of the time, if you're shooting with lights, you don't need ISO 2000, especially if you're using speed boosters to effectively get shallower depth of field. And you can't just stop down the lens because, again, you're going to hit diffraction. And now that you have a 5.7K sensor, you're going to hit that diffraction. It's going to be more evident sooner. There's some diffraction compensation in here, but if you do the math on there, I think diffraction can start at this sensor size at above f8. It might be f8 or f11. That's not that big of a gap there. So, and additionally, on the other side, since it's a 2x crop, to make that shallow depth of field look like what normally people shoot at on a Super 35 sensor, you're normally shooting those f2.8, f4 to get that classical look. You're not doing that here. So f2.8 on this, to me, is slow because you're going to want something that's like f2 or even f1.4 feels pretty good on Micro Four Thirds, but it feels more like 2.8 on something like a S35 camera or full frame sensor. It's a little bit murky there with what you get. So that's why the speed boosters are almost universally used with these cameras, is for that ability to get more shallow depth of field. You're mimicking a faster lens on there. I love the slow motion modes on this, and slow motion eats light. So you can leave that in shutter angle, and you can have your 180-degree shutter. You can put it on variable frame rate. This is the top of the line when it comes to any handheld camera on the menus that Panasonic provides for shooting videos. It equals the S1H. It is absolutely a premium option that can be matched now with full Vlog against any of their professional cameras exactly, which is fantastic. The only thing, I talk about this feels like an intermediate camera because I now want a GH7 that's triple ISO. Give me a triple ISO with a third native value of ISO 50. Because when I was shooting film or Super 16 millimeter, I would always shoot ISO 50 to get the least amount of noise. And if you shoot ISO 50 on Super 16, it looks a lot like the noise that you get typically shooting Super 35 at like ISO 500. So again, with this, I really like this camera. It's fantastic at slow motion. I don't really think it's a huge improvement over the GH5. There are some small improvements all around. I think there's some noise reduction improvements. The ergonomics are fantastic. It is a very big camera. The other thing to note here is the battery. This battery is fine shooting some of the H.265 or lower bitrate modes, but as soon as you shoot ProRes, this thing is gone within less than an hour. So you're talking about like 45 minutes of shooting ProRes with this, maybe 30 minutes. So definitely keep that in mind if you want to get this camera. Obviously, if you have a GH5 rig, you're probably already set up to power this with a V-mount battery or something else. But again, got to ask yourself if you really want to upgrade, if this is really an upgrade for you. I think that an actual upgrade would be changing to a slightly larger sensor to maybe get more dynamic range. This actual mount, JVC did it before. You can put a 1.5 crop sensor in here. You can put a Super 35 sensor on this mount. And I've tested Micro Four Thirds lenses with that, and they do cover for the most part. Definitely the 18 to, well, that gets rid of the speed boosters, and if you're using crop lenses already that are adapted, that just makes them native. I would leave the Micro Four Thirds mount, put a 1.5 crop sensor on there, basically the same that you get in the EVA 1. If you're going to give us ISO 2000 as a base ISO with extended dynamic range, then give us an internal electronic ND like Sony has on the FX6, or give us a lower base ISO to shoot with natively and get the full dynamic range out of the camera to make that worthwhile. Over a GH4, this is an incredible upgrade. This is the same upgrade that the GH5 was to the GH4. Definitely worth it. I think the price for this is fair considering what it can do and what it can match. It is a cheaper alternative to the S1H, but the Panasonic S1 is also about the same price. So if I didn't have either and I didn't have any Micro Four Thirds lenses right now and I had to choose between the GH6 and the regular S1, I would definitely go with the S1 every single time, because that offers all of the same anamorphic options for the same price. I would definitely go with an S1, even though I don't own one, but now I know that I would go with an S1 instead of this.